Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. Suffering is one of the most important aspects when we talk about antinatalism, and there is an organization called Organization for the Prevention of Intense Suffering. We'll talk more about that later on, but they are collecting real world data about people's suffering. You can contribute to this by filling this Google form. I will include the link in the description. Now, 7th October was the first anniversary of the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel. On that occasion, David Benatar was interviewed by Quillette, a news media website on which Benatar has written previously also, including on the subject of Israel-Palestine conflict. The interview itself was not actually on antinatalism, but antinatalism almost lurked from the background at times. At one point, Benatar was asked that if creation of a new being is immoral as it creates new suffering, how is it justified to create a state like Israel in the middle of Muslim countries? Another point that he was asked was if he was a negative utilitarian because he advocates for minimization of suffering, and he said no to that. The answer is more qualified than just a binary yes or no, and you can listen to that in the interview. Also, his new book about practical ethics is coming out on 24th of October, which is also discussed. They talked about which topics in that book are related to antinatalism. Talking of David Benatar, sixth episode of Julio Cabrera's criticism of David Benatar was published. This episode focused on what I'm going to refer to as the S word. Benatar has distinguished between life worth starting and life worth continuing. He has maintained that some lives are worth continuing, but no life is ever worth starting. Also, Benatar recognizes that death is a harm. He says life is bad, but so is death, and life is bad partly due to the badness of death. That is why Benatar's view of antinatalism does not automatically lead to any kind of pro-mortalism, even though Benatar is generally supportive of the right to die in cases where the individual judges their own life to be not worth continuing. Cabrera provides four objections to Benatar's position on the S word. First objection is that life can be sensibly worth continuing, but morally not worth continuing. Sensibly here means in the domain of our senses. So when we say that something is sensibly worth, we are talking about something that satisfies our senses. This can be material like food, water, health, etc., or intellectual like a good piece of entertainment or a good discussion on antinatalism, and so on. Benatar takes a moral stand when talking about starting a new life. That's why it is immoral to have children, it is immoral not to abort, and so on. But when it comes to continuing existing life, Benatar switches to sensible judgment of the person. Cabrera says that if we need a moral reason to start a new life, then we should also look for a moral reason to continue an existing life. A mere desire to satisfy one's own senses cannot be enough. The second objection relates to Benatar's quality of life argument. What people say about quality of their own lives is not reliable. Cabrera talks about two points of views here. One is an internal point of view, and a second one is the external point of view. So, from my internal point of view, my life may not be so bad. It could very well be because of my psychological biases, which Benatar talks about in chapter 3 of Better Never to Have Been. But Benatar says that's not reliable because, from an external point of view, that is, when looked from a scientific and objective way, all lives are bad. He distinguishes between two propositions. One, I am glad to be born, and two, it is better that I came into existence. So I am glad to be born is a judgment from an internal point of view. It is better that I came into existence is from an external point of view. Benatar dedicates whole of chapter 3 to use the external point of view to show the magnitude of harms of coming into existence. But when talking about continuing to exist, Benatar flips to the internal point of view, which is Cabrera's objection. He says what humans say about their death is not reliable. From an internal point of view, humans see their death as worse than it really is. The interests in continuing to live may be affected by the same psychological mechanisms that Benatar describes about quality of life. Here, we should also notice a caution on killing. A Benatarian would be against killing because death is bad, but a Cabrerian would be against killing not because death is bad, but because we should respect the right of others to continue living their bad lives, even though death might be actually good on some views. Cabrera presents two views of death in this context. One is the usual view we think of death. We live our life, and when life stops, death happens, or when death happens, life stops. This he calls as punctual death. Another view, we are born in death, As soon as we start a life, it is bound to die someday. So the whole span of its life is just a prolonged process of dying. This he calls as lived death. And we accept Benatar's position that the quality of all lives is bad, then we can see punctual death as a liberation from this lived death. And so it is good. So even though people might think that their lives are worth continuing, it does not necessarily mean that they in fact are. Third objection is in form of three risks of continuing to live. One is if we continue to live, we run the risk of procreation and having to have an abortion. This to me sounds like an extension of risk argument for procreation. If procreating means imposing a very risky option onto someone else, then continuing to live also means leaving that risk open. It is even stronger for a Cabrerian antinatalist who thinks that abortion is also immoral, although something like vasectomy might come to rescue. Second risk is if we continue to live, we run the risk of harming and manipulating others. We are born in an unjust, unequal society. We try to navigate through that, and a lot of times we have to act immorally. There is just no way around it. I mean, a simple fact that nobody never lies in their life is enough to make this statement, but there are some serious implications. We take medicines that are tested on animals. We use products produced through exploitation of other humans and non humans. There is just no way to survive without this. So we continue these risks by continuing to live. The third risk is of becoming so old that we cannot die with dignity. So that was the third objection. Now, the fourth objection is that our death has no importance at all. Cabrera says that generally it is easy to earn more enemies than make friends. So even though our death may bring sorrow to a few friends, it will bring great joy to many of our enemies. And even in case of friends, if they truly are our friends, they would accept and respect our desire to leave. So these were the four main objections. Apart from that, he also touches on irrationality of continuing to live. If life is so bad as Benatar claims it to be, then it is irrational to continue to live that life. Benatar has said that we should let people behave irrationally, but Cabrera says it is not just irrational, but it is immoral to continue to live. If it is immoral to start a life because life is bad, then it also becomes immoral to continue living, is his main point. He also objects to antinatalists' claim to live on indefinitely or as much as possible. He says that optimists generally admire the fight to live. Cancer patients, for example, are applauded for the will to live and overcoming the disease. But antinatalist pessimists don't have that luxury, and he himself would not continue beyond the threshold of dignity. Finally, he concludes that the real honest answer for an antinatalist pessimist to continue his or her life would be that they are just cowards. Now, again, this was Cabrera's criticism of Benatar. I don't agree with a lot of what he says, and I'm going to continue living my life. But I'm not going to refute what Cabrera has said here for the simple reason that I'm not a qualified philosopher. Also, one very important point, this was a philosophical discussion on continuing or not continuing life as an implication of antinatalist views. I am certainly not advocating anyone to take any steps in their real life from this. That decision should solely lie with the individual alone. But if this sort of philosophy affects you psychologically, then please seek professional help. Don't listen to a random YouTuber like me. ForeignAffairs.com had an article, The Age of Depopulation Surviving a World Gone Grey. The article is not about antinatalism per se. In fact, the word antinatalism does not even appear in there, but it deals with fertility rates and population. So, maybe a peripheral subject to antinatalism. It is no secret that the world's fertility rates are declining. What's special about this article is its extensive approach. Most of the times, when we hear demographers talking about declining birth rates, they are generally talking about industrialized Western countries and a couple more countries like Japan and Korea, and the rest is rest of the world except maybe sub-Saharan Africa where fertility rates are high even today. But this particular article goes in depth of representative countries of each continent. It reviews fertility rates of Australia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central and South Asia, Middle East Asia, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, Latin America, Caribbean, and North America. Declining fertility rate is a global phenomenon, as you can see in this chart. Each continent either is coming below replacement level rate or is approaching the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. Even though sub-Saharan Africa seems an exception, but even over there, it has reduced from 6.8 in the late 1970s to 4.3. It is generally thought that dropping infant mortality, increased education, and improved situation of women tend to decrease the fertility rates. But this turns out not to be true. Stubborn real life exceptions always prevented the formation of any ironclad socio-economic generalization about fertility decline. The article refers to an economist, Land Pritchett, who discovered the most powerful national fertility predictor ever detected. That is what women want. So, if women did not want to have children or wanted to have fewer children, what explains the sudden drop in their desire? There is no concrete answer to this. The article speculates some possibilities like the phenomenon of flight from marriage. As more and more people recognize other styles of relationships, a natural consequence of this is going to be a large population of old people with fewer younger ones to support them. The article goes into details of how countries can cope with this situation and the changes they must do in their social, political, and economic outlook. Now, of course, this is not directly an antinatalist article, but there are some important points to note. One, that even after going into so much details of the reasons of declining fertility, antinatalism did not appear anywhere. People are having fewer children, but that has almost nothing to do with antinatalism. This is a good and bad news at the same time. Bad because it shows how negligible influence this strand of philosophy has on people's decision. Good because all the noise pro natalists keep on making against antinatalism, that is just barking at a wrong tree. And of course, another good thing is, as a consequence of declining fertility rates, whatever reasons there would be, fewer new humans would be created. Secondly, this article very vividly paints a picture of what it is going to be like living in a world with more older people in it. But nowhere is the prospect of extinction mentioned. Neither is there doomers language about population collapse, societal crumble, and so on. The shrinking of the world's population is all but inevitable. The problems this dynamic raises, however, are not necessarily tantamount to a catastrophe. Depopulation is not a grave sentence, rather, it is a difficult new context, one in which countries can still find ways to thrive. So, this was a good, realistic analysis of what's coming without all fear mongering and appeal to emotion. Another article was in a cultural magazine called JotDown in Spanish language, Philosophical Antinatalism as an Opportunity to Revalue Procreation by Pablo Mula Boitrago. The two-part article gives plenty of context around antinatalism, referring earlier pessimist philosophers and their antinatalist inclinations like Schopenhauer, Emil Cioran, Philip Mainlander, Abu Al-Mari, and so on. With a good background, it starts evaluating Benatar, the asymmetry argument, the quality of life argument, a bit of population ethics, and also the fact that Benatar recognizes that most people would continue to have children anyway. Pablo calls Benatar's evaluation of pleasure and pain as utilitarian, or at least a consequentialist evaluation, even if we consider that pain and pleasure are just examples of benefits and harms of life. Pablo's case still remains. Now, Benatar himself has denied being a utilitarian or even a negative utilitarian. But Pablo's point is that Benatar does a sort of consequentialist calculation based on pleasures and pain or benefits and harms of life. But he says that that is not the only way of evaluating life. He takes an example of broken leg. Consider three different scenarios for breaking your leg. In the first scenario, you broke your leg while playing casual football. In the second one, your leg was broken as some form of torture to you. And in the third scenario, you are a firefighter and broke your leg while saving some lives, or you are a military soldier and broke your leg in some battle you fought for your country. Notice that in all three scenarios, the pain and suffering you have to go through is same. The physical harm that is done to you is also same. But in case of firefighting scenario, you would feel proud to have broken your legs for saving lives. In case of torture, you would feel angry, and in case of football, you would just take it as part of the game. So, depending on the purpose of the activity causing us pain, our way of looking at it differs. Pablo says we can apply the same thing to life. The purpose in the case of life becomes meaning of life, and the suffering in it can be looked from different perspectives depending on the meaning that we assign to that life. Pablo knows that there is no cosmic meaning to our lives, but he says there is no indication that having a universal, all encompassing meaning would improve things, and I seriously doubt that knowing our irrelevance to the whole cosmos has diminished our happiness or well being. So, whatever terrestrial meaning we can assign assigned to our lives can overcome the harms caused by the asymmetry between pain and pleasure. The Gordian knot that supposes the asymmetry of pleasure and pain can only be cut by the sword of meaning. Pablo also talks about Benatar's extinctionist view. Benatar prefers certain and immediate suffering to another supposedly great one in a future whose features, however, nobody knows, and what is worse, he brings forward the apocalypse voluntarily in preview that guarantees terrors from which, in theory, he wants to escape. If this is not a repugnant conclusion, it certainly seems so. There is also a contradiction in Benatar's view, I mean, according to Pablo. A phased extinction is preferable to infinite continuation of our species. That's because suffering of so many humans would be prevented. Pablo says there is an analogy of this to individual life. It is true that Benetta's proposal aims to avoid enormous future suffering, but it is no less relevant that individual suicide, including his own, would also be desirable if it adheres to the abundant suffering that a long life guarantees, always according to his theory. Pablo also criticizes Benatar of his style of philosophy. The problems of life, existence, birth, death, and so on are too overwhelming for analytical method of philosophy, which Benatar adopts. Finally, he says one cannot attribute immorality to someone who decides to have children, especially if we adhere to pluralism of values, and that what is best for Benatar does not have to be best for others. Now, did I like the article? Very much. It is not a simple why don't you kill yourself type of internet reply. But do I agree with it? Of course not. There's a lot that can be said to point out the flaws in Pablo's criticism, but I will briefly touch only on a couple of points. One is that about meaning. I don't think Pablo spends enough energy in imagining how our lives could really have been if there was really a cosmic meaning available to us. You don't have to imagine actually, just look at most religious people. In their minds, there is a cosmic divine meaning to life. So it is no surprise that most religions are pro natalist. The fact that such imagined cosmic meaning provides a reason for so many people to procreate tells that its absence makes the case for antinatalism stronger. As for the terrestrial meaning, these can justify actions for existing beings. For example, in the case of firefighter with broken leg, the firefighter already existed. The meaning only provided a way to justify the suffering that he had to endure. Now imagine that a firefighter is going to come into existence along with the suffering of the broken leg, so that just by him coming into existence, some lives are going to be saved. Could such an act be justified from that firefighter's point of view? Before coming into existence, that potential firefighter had no interest in finding such meaning and saving lives. This is why terrestrial meanings can justify continuation of existence of already existing lives. It cannot do the same job for coming into existence of new lives. That also answers Pablo's criticism of individual suicide versus species extinction. In case of individual suicide, there exist interests which could be satisfied or frustrated. In case of species extinction, the passive version through non procreation, of course, we are talking about stopping the creation of those interests to start with. There was a guest post on the Oxford University's Practical Ethics blog, Must Antinatalists Be Pessimist by Mati Hairi. Now, generally, antinatalists are pessimists. Benatar, for sure, is a pessimist philosopher, and Julio Cabrera might as well be. Mati mentions other examples of Schopenhauer, Philip Mainlander, Emil Chiron, Peter Wiesel Zapfer. But Mati says that it is not necessary that we have to be pessimists in order to be antinatalists. In general, an optimist expects good things to happen, a pessimist expects bad things to happen. Applied to human reproduction, optimists assume that their future children's lives will be good. Pessimists anticipate that their possible children's lives would be bad. So, a pessimist in this context is the one who assumes the possibility of life being bad to be the reality. But you don't have to do that. You can just recognize that that is just one possibility and the risk of such possibility is not justified. Now, you might argue that we take risks all the time in our life, but there are two fundamental differences. In case of procreation, we are taking risk on behalf of someone else, which is the potential child. And although Mati does not mention this, but we are taking that risk without their consent because we can't obtain their consent. Secondly, we can still take the risk and have the child, and the possibility of her life containing large suffering may not even realize. But then that child can have children of their own, and so on. And given given an infinite number of iterations, the small probability of suffering in life approaches to 1. This is similar to the case of flipping a loaded coin. Let's say the coin is loaded such that 99 out of 100 times I get heads. Then the probability that I would get tails in one flip is just 0.01. But as I keep on flipping it again and again, by the time I reach 100 flips, I am going to get at least one tail. So even the small probability of extreme suffering would realize in an infinite procreative chain. And so taking this risk is not justified. Mati calls this risk averse approach procreative realism. Lawrence Anton appeared on the Dissenter interview. I'm not going to summarize the discussion here because you get an idea looking at the chapters underneath the video. The discussion was more to do with antinatalist activism, like what sort of arguments work in which setting of activism and which ones are more appealing to people, and so on. And in that episode, it was revealed that Ricardo Lopez will soon be featuring on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast hosted by Amanda. Talking of Exploring Antinatalism podcast, we started with the Organization for the Prevention of Intense Suffering, OPIS, and we will end with that. 93rd episode of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast was released. It was an interview of Jonathan Leighton, but it was not the usual Exploring Antinatalism episode though. The actual interview of Jonathan Leighton will be out sometime next year. This episode was specifically about that survey that we started with. Jonathan is working on a project which can provide some idea of how much suffering there is in real world. So the survey not only asks about your state right now, but also about your past suffering conditions. And the email address is optional, so this is pretty anonymous survey. The whole discussion was about the survey and the suffering implied within it, and also asked about non-human animal suffering. Jonathan presented some ideas of how he would be collecting data about animal suffering by talking to experts in the respective fields. This is quite a unique initiative, and if your antinatalism is suffering focused like mine is, then you should definitely take the survey.